My fellow Americans, tonight I come before you not as a former president, not as a Democrat or a Republican, but as a citizen who loves this country, as someone who believes deep in his bones that America is still the greatest experiment in self-government the world has ever known. But experiments require care. They require truth. They require that we not only cherish our freedoms, but that we protect them, not with words alone, but with courage, with responsibility, with love of neighbor, and with a willingness to say enough. Now I know there's been noise, there's been anger, there's been division, there's been talk of revenge, of retribution, of rewriting the truth until it no longer resembles reality. And some of that noise, my friends, comes from Mr. Trump. Let me be clear, this isn't about politics. It's about character. It's about decency. It's about the soul of America. Because I've seen what happens when we forget who we are. I've seen it in Charlottesville. I've seen it in the Capitol on January 6th. I've seen it when truth is twisted into a weapon, when patriotism is worn like a mask while hate festers underneath. But I've also seen something else. I've seen the nurse who worked 3 shifts straight during a pandemic and still went home and helped her kids with homework. I've seen the immigrant who arrived with nothing but built a life, a business, a community. I've seen young people marching peacefully for justice, not for themselves, but for those long silenced. And I've seen America rise before, when the night seemed darkest, when hope felt far away. Mr. Trump may speak loudly. He may tap into anger, but noise is not leadership. Bullying is not strength, and division is not destiny. Leadership means lifting others up, even when you disagree. It means telling the truth, even when it's hard. And it means reminding people that we are in this together. Because America has never been about one man. It's about all of us. It's about the factory worker in Ohio who never gave up, even when the plant closed. The single mom in Georgia who taught her son to read by candlelight. The veterans who fought not just for their country, but for the idea that everyone deserves dignity. That's who we are. That's the America I know. So when I speak to Mr. Trump and to those who follow him, I say this: you are not above the truth. You are not above the Constitution. And you are not above the American people. We are not a nation of fear. We are a nation of resilience, a nation of progress, a nation of imperfect people working every day to build a more perfect union. Now, I know some folks feel tired. Some feel cynical. But if we give in to that, if we surrender the future to those who peddle lies and division, then we lose the very thing that makes this country worth fighting for. So let us choose a different path. Let us stand together as neighbors, as workers, as students, as dreamers and doers. Let us write a new chapter not in anger, but in hope. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all my years of service, it's this: ordinary people can do extraordinary things. So don't wait for someone else to fix it. Be the one who speaks up. Be the one who votes. Be the one who shows kindness when it's not easy. Be the one who reminds others that democracy is not a spectator sport. Let us lift our gaze once more toward the horizon. Let us believe once more that change is possible, that justice matters, that truth matters, that we matter. And let us remember that in this country, when we stand together, when we work together, when we believe together, yes, we can. In every generation, there comes a moment when the truth gets tested, not just by our enemies, but by our own voices. And right now, we are living through such a moment. We are surrounded by noise. Noise on our screens. Noise in our politics. Noise that drowns out compassion, masks dishonesty as strength, and dresses fear up as patriotism. But truth, my friends, has never needed to shout. Truth does not need to dominate the headlines or go viral on social media to matter. Truth is patient. It is steady. And it is what holds the fabric of this democracy together. We've seen what happens when noise takes over. When anger is louder than empathy, when headlines outpace facts, when politicians speak not to unite, but to inflame. And we've seen people, good people, fall prey to the noise because it was easier to be outraged than to ask hard questions, easier to follow a slogan than to seek real solutions. Yet across this country, in towns big and small, I've met Americans who are tuning out the noise. A teacher in Michigan who shuts off the evening news and focuses on preparing her students for a future rooted in science and history. A farmer in Iowa who listens not to the conspiracy theories, but to the wisdom passed down through generations about hard work and integrity. A veteran in Texas who knows that serving your country isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's quiet, even when it's hard. That's the truth. It's in the quiet sacrifices, the honest conversations, the everyday acts of courage. It doesn't need a microphone. It just needs us to listen. Now, some folks have built careers around making noise. They spread misinformation not because they believe it, but because it sells, because it wins votes, because it distracts from the work they failed to do. But democracy isn't sustained by volume. It's sustained by values. It's sustained by people who are willing to say, I'd rather lose an argument with integrity than win one built on lies. And let's be clear, truth doesn't belong to one party. It's not red or blue. It doesn't care about polling numbers or social media metrics. Truth is bigger than that. It's the cornerstone of justice. It's the foundation of trust. And when truth is strong, America is strong. Our founders didn't write the Constitution for a nation of echo chambers. They wrote it for citizens. Thinking, reasoning citizens who could distinguish truth from propaganda, substance from spectacle. That's our responsibility. Not just to consume information, but to question it. Not just to react, but to reflect. Because when we allow noise to define our reality, we lose sight of what matters. We lose sight of each other. We lose sight of the quiet strength that has always driven this country forward. From the factory floor to the voting booth. From the courthouse steps to the kitchen table. From the protests for justice to the promises we make to our children. From the solemn truth that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. It is complicity. From the enduring hope that if we stand firm in the truth, no matter how loud the noise gets, our democracy can still shine brighter than any lie ever shouted through a megaphone. ChatGPT, you said, the power of ordinary Americans, expand it in 500 words and never add any ending sentence. ChatGPT said, the power of ordinary Americans, in the style of Barack Obama, 500 words, no ending sentence. I've always believed that the strength of this nation doesn't come from the marble halls of Washington. It doesn't come from the wealth of our stock markets or the firepower of our military alone. No, America's strength, its true and lasting strength, has always come from ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things, not for fame, not for power, but because it was the right thing to do. It comes from the single mother in Detroit working 2 jobs, still showing up to parent-teacher conferences, still believing that her child's future is worth every sleepless night. It comes from the janitor in New Mexico who cleans the same school he once attended, they walking those halls with quiet pride because he believes every child deserves a clean space to learn and dream. It comes from the young dreamer in Los Angeles who grew up reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, who tutors others in English after school, who still believes there's a place for him in the only country he's ever called home. These folks don't make headlines. They don't have blue check marks next to their names. But they're the reason this country works. They're the reason we've weathered storms before. They're the ones who step up when the levees break, when the fires rage, when the pandemic strikes. They organize food drives, check in on neighbors, build shelters, vote quietly in local elections, and keep showing up, even when the odds are stacked against them. They are the reason that after every tragedy, after every injustice, we rise. They are the steel in our backbone, the moral compass that keeps us from drifting too far off course. And they remind us, again and again, that hope is not found in the halls of power, but in the hands of people who get up every morning determined to make life just a little better than it was the day before. I've seen this power with my own eyes. I've seen it in a room of high school students in Chicago's South Side who, despite losing friends to gun violence, still believe in their right to learn and grow and lead. I've seen it in rural Kentucky, where coal miners retrain for tech jobs, not because it's easy, but because they believe in the dignity of work and the future of their families. I've seen it in the eyes of nurses who held the hands of strangers in ICU wards when families couldn't be there, whispering comfort through fogged-up goggles and aching fatigue. These ordinary Americans are not waiting for permission to make change. They are not waiting for politicians to give them the go-ahead to do what is just. They step forward again and again, not because they're fearless, but because they believe that even their small act of courage can ripple outward, that their quiet resolve matters, that in a country built by generations of bricklayers, teachers, mechanics, and caregivers, their role in this democracy is sacred, their story is necessary, their hands are capable of building a nation as bold and big as its ideals. You said, leadership means responsibility, expand it in 500 words, and never add any ending sentence. ChatGPT said, leadership means responsibility in the style of Barack Obama, 500 words, no ending sentence. Leadership, at its core, is not about glory or applause. It's not about power for power's sake or the number of cameras in front of your face. Leadership is about responsibility. It is about showing up when it's uncomfortable, speaking the truth when it's inconvenient, and standing firm when the ground beneath you starts to shake. Too often, especially in times like these, we see individuals who seek the title of leader, but flee the weight that comes with it. They want the microphone, but not the accountability. They want to steer the ship, but they refuse to take the blame when it drifts off course. But real leadership doesn't work that way. You don't get to enjoy the privileges and ignore the duties. You don't get to stir up anger and walk away from the consequences. If you light the match, you're responsible for the fire. Responsibility means telling your supporters not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. It means putting country over ego, service over self-interest. It means understanding that every word you speak, every policy you shape, every decision you make affects real people, families, workers, children who depend on your integrity. I've sat in that chair. I've felt the pressure that comes with it. And let me tell you, the hardest days aren't when things are going smoothly. It's when tragedy strikes, when there's no perfect answer, when you have to make a choice that will upset some, but save others. That's when leadership is tested. Not when you're on stage, but when you're alone and your conscience is the only voice in the room. I remember speaking to a father in Connecticut who had just lost his little girl in a school shooting. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding revenge. He was asking, pleading for someone to take responsibility, not just for what had happened, but for what would happen if we did nothing. That moment stayed with me, because leadership is not just about responding in the moment. It's about preventing the next moment from becoming a tragedy. And responsibility doesn't end when you leave office. It doesn't disappear when the cameras turn off. You are accountable for the tone you set, the standards you uphold, the example you leave behind for the next generation. You are accountable for whether your words build or break, heal or hurt. Some will try to shift blame. They'll point fingers at the media, at immigrants, at institutions, at anyone but themselves. But leadership doesn't look for scapegoats. It takes ownership. It stands tall not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. And it reminds us all that this democracy isn't maintained by slogans or spectacle. It's preserved by people who are willing to do the hard work, to make the tough calls, to accept that responsibility isn't a burden to avoid, but a trust to be earned again and again in the small, quiet choices and the great public decisions alike. You said hope is a choice, not a feeling. Expand it in 700 words and never add any ending sentence. ChatGPT said hope is a choice, not a feeling, in the style of Barack Obama. 700 words, no ending sentence. Hope is not nalave. It is not some soft notion reserved for greeting cards and speeches. Hope, in its most powerful form, is a decision. A deliberate act of defiance in the face of despair. Hope is what built this nation. Not because the people who shaped it had easy lives, but because despite hardship, despite injustice, despite fear, they chose to believe in something better. Now, I've seen a lot of people lately feeling overwhelmed. I've seen folks tuned into the news, trying to make sense of the chaos and wondering if the country they love is slipping away. I've heard the voices of young people asking whether their voices matter, whether their votes count, whether anything will ever really change. I've felt the weariness in families struggling to make ends meet, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, wondering if all the effort is worth it. And I've been there too. I've sat in rooms with parents who've lost their children to gun violence. I've held the hands of Americans crushed by natural disasters. I've walked through neighborhoods where hope felt like a luxury few could afford. But even in those places, even in the darkest corners of our story, I've also seen something extraordinary. I've seen people who, against all odds, still choose hope, like the mother in Mississippi whose home was washed away by the floodwaters. Yet she showed up the next day at the community center with 2 arms full of donated clothes. Like the teenager in Ohio who grew up in foster care, bounced from house to house, but still stood up at graduation as valedictorian. Like the veteran in Arizona who lost both legs in service overseas, but now spends his days mentoring young people to believe in their own strength. These are not just stories. These are reminders that hope is an act. It is a discipline. It is something we hold on to not because everything is perfect, but because giving up means surrendering the future. And that's not the American way. Hope says, I will vote even if I think the system is broken, because not voting guarantees nothing changes. Hope says, I will keep fighting for justice, even when justice feels too far away, because silence has never brought about progress. Hope says, I will raise my children with compassion and respect, even in a world that feels unkind, because what I model in my home shapes the character of this nation. There are those who will mock hope. They will call it weakness. They will tell you that the world is cruel and you'd better get yours before someone else does. They will try to convince you that division is permanent, that hate is natural, that power only belongs to the ruthless. But they are wrong. History shows us that hope has always been the engine of progress. It is what led abolitionists to keep organizing even when the law told them they had no voice. It is what carried suffragettes through jail cells and mockery until they won the right to vote. It is what pushed civil rights marchers across bridges even when the batons came down hard. Hope is not about ignoring reality. It is about facing it head on, with eyes wide open and hands still working. It is about choosing to build when others tear down, to believe when others retreat, to try when others stop. I remember walking into that old, crumbling church in Charleston after the shooting, seeing families grieving, tears falling down their faces. And I remember how they chose forgiveness. They chose to sing. They chose to love in the very space where hate had tried to take root. That is hope. That is power. That is who we are when we remember who we've always been at our best. We can't always control what happens to us. We can't always prevent the hardship or the heartbreak. But we can decide how we respond. We can choose whether we let fear close our hearts or let courage open them, whether we wall ourselves off or reach across divides. Whether we despair or whether we dig deeper, stand taller and press forward together with the quiet conviction that our efforts, our unity, our compassion still matter in this great American story we are writing every single day with our words, our votes, our voices, our hands, and our hearts. You said democracy requires all of us expand it in 700 words and never add any ending sentence. ChatGPT said, democracy requires all of us in the style of Barack Obama, 700 words, no ending sentence. Democracy has never been a guarantee. It is not etched in stone or handed down from generation to generation without effort. Democracy is not automatic. It lives or dies by the choices we make, not just every 4 years at the ballot box, but every single day. It's a living promise, not a finished product. And it requires all of us. When the founders wrote those words, we the people, they weren't writing about a perfect nation. They were writing about a collective responsibility. They were imagining a country that would only work if the people were willing to do the work. Not just the powerful, not just the wealthy, not just the people who looked a certain way or worshipped a certain way or loved a certain way. All of us. And that responsibility doesn't just fall on elected officials or people with titles before their names. It falls on the teacher in Atlanta who refuses to give up on a struggling student, on the grocery clerk in Kansas who treats every customer with dignity, even when the world outside seems angry and divided, on the retired nurse in Arizona who organizes rides to polling places, because she remembers a time